Fatima, thank you very much, and apologies for the long list. Yes, I think that's always a mistake to put that in the background. Let me begin by welcoming you all very warmly on this cold spring morning here in London, and also to acknowledge, I think, the Secretary of State's very unequivocal commitment of the UK to maintain its level of engagement and financing also of development internationally. The organizers, and again to also the Bonn conference, thank you for inviting me to address you here this morning as part of the, let's say, review of the scene setting. And my task is not an easy one, because in some ways we meet in these conferences in order to focus our attention on priorities and also in order to advance what we believe are both gains and priorities that lie ahead of us. And yet, it cannot be denied that as we meet here in London today, development, the Sustainable Development Agenda, and that principle of solidarity between North and South are actually facing some fairly severe crises. Indeed, I would say in some respects, in some parts of the world, a consensus that has been carefully built and nurtured over many years is right now under assault. Rhetorically, politically, ideologically, financially. And therefore it is a very disturbing time. And some would call it a turbulent period through which we are about to pass when it comes to some of the fundamental tenets that have underpinned much of what we consider to be an international development consensus. And in that respect, I would have wished perhaps the Secretary of State to acknowledge a little bit more explicitly that in leading UK aid, in also reinforcing Britain's capacity to be a leader in partnership around development, we have to now face a public policy discourse that needs to be tackled head-on, because what we are seeing time and again is the questioning of things that we in this hall may consider to be givens, but that some, whether in the media, in parties, in political movements, or just in communities that have no connection to the reality of your work, are putting into question. And this is deeply disturbing, because it is out of proportion with the actual amount of money that is often invested in some of the most fundamental life-saving humanitarian interventions. It is also not recognizing, as the Secretary pointed out just now, that very often aid, UK aid, and also development finance is as much in the interests of the community receiving it as it is for the community giving it. And this is not just in cultural or in political terms, but also in very clear economic terms. So let me dwell for a moment on the roller coaster, as I would call it, of sustainable development, because we have gone through a strange couple of years. Moments of surprise and remarkable breakthroughs, the Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals. And I know that particularly here in London and in Whitehall, there are some who consider the SDGs and that which emerged from them as too complex, difficult to communicate to the public. I would urge you to take a step back and reflect for a moment about the phenomenal thing that we witnessed when an Agenda 2030 was adopted in New York. It's the first time in the 70-year history of multilateralism post-Second World War where the world has actually negotiated a shared agenda. We have no longer find ourselves in a world which we divide into North and South as the only defining criterion for sustainable development. In fact, we have a universal agenda developed, articulated with 17 goals, indicators and targets by nations themselves. And this is not so straightforward. It is also, for the first time, a truly integrated agenda, because ever since the Earth Summit in '92, we have this term sustainable development, but we actually operated in many respects as if the three pillars were still three silos and not three pillars of a sustainable development architecture. And here we have the SDGs that truly have taken a bold step forward in making explicit the inherent nexus, connectivity, and interdependence in moving forward in one of the three domains in order to also advance the other two. So not only conceptually and politically, is the Agenda 2030 a remarkable achievement, also against the backdrop of what was happening in the world already. So here we have the International Development Agenda achieving remarkable breakthroughs. They were followed just a couple of months later by something that few expected would happen, the Paris Agreement. Again, after 25 years of trying to bring the science to the attention of the public, putting the climate change issue on the radar of those who have to make decisions beyond the interests of only the next election cycle, indeed now intergenerationally, we succeeded in actually agreeing a global climate change response. Now, there may be some of you in this hall who will view this with skepticism and perhaps cynicism because paper can be very patient. But you know, tell me where in history do you not need multiple approaches that allow both a social movement to emerge, public pressure to be developed, and at the same time then those who have to enact those decisions to agree on steps to be taken, particularly on an issue such as climate change, which imposes on every nation such, in historical terms, unequal terms of responding to this challenge. And that is why we also took so long. OECD countries essentially are carrying a certain amount of the burden that they historically are responsible for in acting on climate change, but far, far from what would actually be a fair formula. Instead, it is developing nations, emerging economies who took the biggest steps forward in joining a climate change agreement with voluntary commitments that will allow the world to now address climate change in a collective sense. And for those of you who again will say, well, paper is remarkably patient, just take a look. What we're seeing in the renewable energy economy across the world, or in India, which already 3 years ahead of schedule has implemented its own voluntary targets in terms of installing new renewable energy generating, electricity generating capacity. And many of the other examples of leadership in the South, well ahead of some of the levels of ambition that have been taken by more wealthy countries. And then just last year, the Kigali Amendment. Maybe many of you may not even have heard of it. It's part of the Montreal Protocol, probably one of the most successful attempts at bringing the world together to solve a global problem, namely the hole in the ozone layer. 30 years later, it is succeeding in what I often refer to as the greatest planetary repair job ever attempted. Hardly noticed by the world. And yet in Kigali last year, nations yet again agreed on a fundamentally important decision to global warming and climate change, namely to deal with substances that if we cannot keep them out of our economies, equipment and industries, will actually make achieving a 2-degree target virtually impossible. So here are the achievements, great breakthroughs in a politically difficult moment, and then the roller coaster immediately goes in the other direction. A falling apart over a refugee crisis, which in itself is rooted in many failures of being able to respond collectively and individually as nations to developments that have literally unfolded before our very own eyes. And let me here also remind many of you who probably were part of trying to tell this story, namely that a few years ago, before people started trying to get across the Mediterranean and literally risking the lives, their own lives, that of their children, their families to escape, we were in the United Nations appealing to the world to provide further funding to be able to go into those refugee camps and provide food and education and medical support. Instead, we had to ration food. We had to cut education institutions such as schools, primary schools, and we actually had to close health posts in those refugee camps because funding was not forthcoming. It was one of the great tragedies and misjudgments of governments in Europe and others in the region not to act at the time. And when people have nothing left to eat, no opportunity for their children, not even fundamental health care being provided, what alternative do they have but to flee? And here unfolds this terrible, terrible crisis that has cost so many lives, is rooted in an even greater tragedy of the international community not being able to act together and collectively geopolitically. And then we see the European Union almost falling apart over an issue such as refugees, totally out of proportion in numerical terms, but fundamentally testing in political terms. What a strange moment. So on the one hand, great commitment to acting collectively, and then brutal failures and moments of introspection just a few months later. And now a new US administration that literally is turning away from many of the things that its preceding administration was not only central to, but agreed to. In fact, if some of the cuts that are now being envisaged financially in US funding, whether for international development programs bilaterally or multilaterally, really were to happen, this would be a disaster. Let us be very clear. It would de facto not only kill programs, it would actually end up leaving many people either uncared for or perhaps in a situation where they will die. It's as clear, as crass, and as dramatic as that. So that is the roller coaster that I allude to, and I say, as we meet here in London today and look at development, look at the Sustainable Development Agenda, we have greater understanding, we better comprehend the planetary boundaries within which we are supposed to operate, and we also have far greater appreciation of things that work, of the coalitions also across different institutional parts that work, as the Secretary of State alluded, whether it is non-governmental civil society organizations, the private sector, government, federal, local. We have learned a great deal about how to scale up action and how to intervene. And yet, if we do not look at that broader context, we will actually miss perhaps a tsunami of political disruption that is very serious to keeping the world on a shared path towards the future. Now, as I said, it is a roller coaster, so let me for a moment also not leave you in a state of depression at the beginning of the conference, because the remarkable thing is that narrative is the kind of narrative we have across the Atlantic. And you could even broaden it to the OECD countries. But when you step back for a moment and put aside all the debates in some countries in Europe about nationalism and xenophobia and turning away from the international system and fundamentally shared values, you actually realize that more than 4/5 of humanity actually don't live in these countries, these few countries that have now become very focused on those issues. More than 4/5 of humanity actually lives in parts of the world where Agenda 2030, moving towards a low-carbon economy, leaving no one behind, moving the agricultural sector, and achieving food security, are actually paramount to the daily agenda in politics, in economics, in investment, in economic progress. So one of my first messages this morning is we live through a period of highly amplified risks, particularly at the donor end of the development agenda. But on the other end, namely those who are now increasingly also taking charge of their development decisions and look for partnerships and not for charity or aid in the traditional sense, things look very differently. And we should be very conscious of that, because otherwise we will become totally consumed by a few countries with their domestic politics overriding the broader reality of what is actually defining what is happening in the world today. Second litmus test, Marrakesh, the Climate Change Convention. On the day that Barack Obama, and therefore also his administration coming to an end, and Hillary Clinton lost the election and Donald Trump was elected, parties were meeting in Marrakesh at the Conference of the Parties. And I think you saw there just the flickering of the capacity of nations to move forward, even if one nation, even a significant nation, is not prepared to be part of that consensus. Now, I mention this not out of any delight, but rather to sensitize all of us to the fact that the next few years will be critical in focusing on things not that divide us, but that unify us. Where the principle that Nelson Mandela used in the negotiation of the new South Africa, namely the principle of sufficient consensus, is what builds alliances, rather than focusing on the areas that we differ on. Because only that way can you contain a major country's, let's say, inclination or temptation to believe that it can exist outside a collective consensus on how to address issues that only can be addressed together. The emergence of China, to some still unknown, difficult to interpret. Its leadership in the G20. You saw many different aspects emerge there that point to a country that so far has been very reluctant to cautious to being engaged in global leadership, actually stepping forward and saying it is going to be part of defending many of these agreements and principles. So we could go on with many examples that illustrate that, yes, you can look at the moment through which we are passing right now as truly turbulent, but you can also put it in perspective and begin to develop a strategy. Just briefly, we also need to look at how, for instance, the challenges that emanate from agreements such as the climate change agreement, transitioning towards a low carbon and inclusive green economy, are not only framed in terms of challenges, but also opportunities. We can now look on a continent like Africa at the next 20 to 30 years as unprecedented in the opportunity it has created through its renewable energy pathways that are now opening up to actually give people access to electricity. 2/3 of the continent to this day do not have access to electricity. And yet renewables are becoming a shortcut for the poorest, but also an opportunity for many of the economies in Africa to invest beyond foreign partners to actually moving forward. You're giving me a time signal. I was given 25 minutes, but let me move very quickly forward. So we could go on in transport, in many other areas. The digital economy, again, extraordinary opportunities also in developing countries for accessing global marketplaces, platforms, becoming part of a global economy, yet also facing the challenge of employment, just transitions that allow people to actually find jobs in this futuristic robotic AI economy. The future of our food systems. Again, tremendous opportunities against the backdrop of extraordinary challenges. How on earth we will feed 10 billion people without continuing to deplete the very capital stock in terms of our ecological infrastructure is an unanswered question. Health systems. Secretary of State alluded to it. Pandemics. Antimicrobial resistance. Affordable drugs, all in some ways challenges, but also opportunities. But let me end, because that's what I was asked to do, with just 4 challenges, and it'll take me 2 minutes. So what happens next? My first appeal to all of you would be also in this conference here, is to help people in Britain maintain a perspective on what is actually happening. Allow them to understand the broader context. Allow them also to understand some of the numbers that are being used. This regrettable campaign that is emanating from some newspapers now about should the UK cut its aid budget. It's, to me, sometimes astonishing how little people then have a reference to, for instance, the fact that, expenditures in the UK just on pets is over £7 billion a year. Let us put that in perspective for a moment with actually being able to invest in development for the many reasons that we no doubt will discuss over the next 2 days. Secondly, let us also make sure that those agreed goals are seen not only as challenges, but actually as opportunities. Opportunities including in the context of not only the partners in the South, but opportunities for the UK. The future of, for instance, Africa's power sector will actually define in the next 30 years far more dramatically and directly whether a Paris Agreement is relevant to the future of humanity than what happens in China in the next 30 years. There will be 2 billion citizens on the African continent around 2040, 2050. There will be only one continent that actually is not only going to double its population, but also connect more than 3/4 of its existing population to power sources. My third point would be maintain, by all means, the focus on leave no one behind. But do not neglect the broader building of economies, because aid cannot replace the domestic capacity to build jobs and opportunities and resilience. Finally, finance. Let us also be clear. In the year 2000, Africa's tax revenue was around 180 billion and aid was 48 billion. In 2014, tax revenue is over 600 billion in Africa and aid has actually decreased to 42 billion. So the relevance in terms of catalyst, strategic direction setting, entrepreneurship and innovation remains immensely important. And then by simply appealing also to looking at this debate about governance, not only being focused on the capacity building of civil servants and those in the executive. I think we have for far too long neglected that accountability and good governance have as much to do with what happens in government and the executive as it has to do with building the capacity of legislatures, parliaments to challenge the executive, and for courts and the judiciary to be strengthened, because they are, at the end of the day, the last recourse for a citizen to challenge the inaction, including non-adherence to international commitments of their governments. Thank you very much.